This is the Raptor Ranger, designed by Frankie Rogers, sculpted by Fabio for our own Patreon, that is the Groundeffected one, and it is a original character. This means that you have absolutely no way of getting this character or anything about this character other than from our own Patreon. Check out the link down below. It goes without saying that this is Groundeffected, and my name is your dad. And this video was sponsored by me. I'm gonna get Frankie to quickly tell us the inspiration for making this model.
Well, I've always loved dinosaurs.
Well, that's really nice, Frankie, but let's just get some primer on this model and get it painted. Now, before I prime them, actually, I do need to do a little bit of preparation. I do want to mention that I support all the models that are available on my Patreon, myself personally. If you are interested in joining my Patreon to get the original files that we make, by the way, that is another one that is coming in the next couple of weeks, then you should go check out my own Patreon in the description down below. That is my own ad read done. I'm going to now paint this model because that is enough of that nonsense. And to start off with, I'm going to obviously take the model apart, even though I had put it together, but obviously I had put it together to check that everything fit well. Once I was convinced of that, I had sanded off any tiny little support marks and filled any holes that I needed to. Then I will take this primer and spray this over everything. Not only does this give me a good layer to paint over the top of, but it also gives me a dark color into the shadows. And because I need the shadows to not be light, this is going to be helpful later on, especially now. As you can see, I'm putting a zenithal highlight over everything. Well, technically in my case this is actually a volumetric highlight, which means that it is not necessarily coming from just the top only. It is going over all the areas that I feel like light would be pretty much hitting. This is going to help create the undercoat for the layers that I'll put on later. For example, using this red leather now over the top of the pant, it is going to help make it look like there is darker shadows than there would have been if I just sprayed it straight over white or grey or something like that. In fact, even if I try to spray this straight over black, it would take so many more layers and just mean so much more work. And I don't have the inclination to put in that much more work. So I'm going to move on to telling you how I painted these plants, and I just sprayed them with orc flesh, and halfway through I realized I cannot have all the plants the same color, so I put a bit of yellow ink into the orc flesh to make it a bit brighter of a green. I then painted a tan color over the shoes and then showed you some fancy shots of all the stuff hanging out of a precarious place on my camera. This is because I feel like this is the best way to hang things. If you are not living life on the edge and encouraging things to fall off and break, well then are you even truly hobbying at the end of the day? But daydreaming of parts not falling off of precarious positions aside, we need to get back to painting this thing, and I need to start off with the shoes. I like to start off with a place that is pretty much easy for me, something that I know I can get a small, quick, easy win on, and that is going to be painting these shoes, pretty much using a little bit of skeleton horde in the shadows, and then just spraying a highlight over the top of the shoes is good enough for a base coat for me. I'm going to take some silver from Ammo by Meg and spray that over the metallic things that she has hanging off of her belt. And then, just to quickly set up the skin tones, I'm going to spray this brown rose over the top of the zenithal that I had originally put down. This paint is probably 50-50 mixed with water, and I spray it over the top of the zenithal because the black that stays underneath will remain dark, and this is going to help me when I come to actually doing the skin tones later. Now, quickly working on the base, I'm going to throw down a little bit of green before I actually start dry brushing, and this base needs to be mostly sand. So starting with a color called dark rust, which is actually a brown, and I'm going to paint that over the top of everything using a dry brush from Artis Opus. This is the biggest one that they make, and I'm pretty much wet dry brushing at this point. And I'm going to now take a red leather and paint that over the top of this using that same dry brush, and I'm going to pretty much be a little bit drier painting at this point now. I start out actually technically a little bit wet painting, and then slowly but surely the paint gets drier and drier as I start grabbing more edges. Here particularly, this paint will be very dry on the brush. It will be I don't really actually know how to explain it. Like, I feel like these words are not working, but basically I use more paint on the brush when I'm wet painting, and then I use less paint. I wipe off as much of it as I can in order to just catch the edges of things. Like, for example, using this deck tan now, the brush needs to be really dry. If it is got too much paint on it, you're just going to overpaint everything, and it's going to look a little bit weird. And now obviously we don't want that, so let's never do that. Next step will be for me to paint all of the little rocks that are on the ground side of the base, which is the side that's brown. I'm not actually sure how I'm going to differentiate from these parts, but I've decided one is ground and one is rock. These rocks needed to have an undercoat on them because I'm going to come back a little bit later and I will dry brush over the top of them, but for now I need to make sure that they have the sufficient color underneath them and they are not dry brushed with any of the other colors that are across the base. Using some of that dark rust again, I'm going to paint that over the top of the little skulls that is in the base. I'm pretty sure it's just one skull and it's the top and bottom part of the skull, but it doesn't matter. There are two portions of this that need to have this brown painted over them. Now I can turn my attention to the vinery that is going across the base, and this is going to be done using a brightish green. But of course I'm not going to go over any of the areas where the rocks are yet, because if I do, when I come back and dry brush them later, I will end up getting all of that rock color onto these vines, and obviously that is not a thing that I want to have happen. Otherwise that's going to mean I'm going to have to paint the green again, and we all know I do not want to put any more effort than is absolutely necessary to painting this model. So like I said, I was going to dry brush those rocks, and I could have done multiple steps for this, but I literally just took a little bit of light grey and then deck tan straight over. And since deck tan was already on my palette, I decided I would just use this to paint over the top of everything that I painted dark rust before. Now when I do this, what I'm doing is leaving a very fine line of the dark rust around the edge, and this deck tan is going on the inside slightly, almost like how I paint an eye, where I put the blacks and then paint the whites of the eye around the inside, kind of like framing it. I'm doing the same kind of trick here, and this helps to frame these pieces on the base. It gives it a separation from the ground that it is in, and also at the same time it makes it white, because obviously they're skulls, but they can't be too white. So I will take some skeleton horde and spray this over them. Overspray at this point doesn't really matter because it's ground, so it's going to have a little bit of weird colors in it. I then also took a little bit of Agrax Earthshade and painted that into the shadows of this base section, and then I can attach the rock to the ground and attach all the plants and move it aside so I can start working on the rest of the model. Starting with the pants, and for the pants I had pretty much sprayed in a Gilliman flesh into the shadows. This is kind of a browny reddy color, but it was not red enough, so I decided to take some Caribou Crimson and spray that over everything in the shadows before I then went back in with a small bit of a lighter tan color that I mixed into the red leather in order to give it a highlight. This is to make sure that my shadows and highlights were so far apart from each other that there was a great value between the two. Now of course the next steps would be painting the belt, and the belt needed to just be painted with Cygor Brown, which is one of the very few colors that you can paint that don't actually look like terrible if you're using a brush. I really don't know how people use these contrast paints with a brush, because they are not easy to work with. They generally make the biggest mess of everything that I've ever tried, but Cygor Brown is one of those colors that I can tell you is fairly easy to work with, so I use it a lot. This is why you may see it in many of my videos. I used silvers to paint over the belt buckle. This is a dark silver from Monument Hobbies, and it works very nicely. The next step is to add a little bit more detail, and using Agrax Earthshade and a small brush, I'm going to just trace over some of the raised edges that are on these pants. I don't know what these things would be for in real life, but they are on the pants, and I decided making them a little bit darker would just help to put a little bit more depth and detail into these pants without as much effort as needed. Now the next step is to work on the shoes, and on these shoes there is some buckles that the straps or the laces are going through, and these need to be painted first before I actually paint the laces. So to paint those, I used dark silver over the top of them, and then I carefully took a little bit of skeleton horde to kind of paint around some of the details on the shoes. Specifically, any of the lines that were on the shoes, I just picked one side of the line and just followed that line all the way around the shoe. This will dry up a little bit later, and it will make it look like the shoe has more depth and detail to it as well. Then it was as simple as literally just painting Cygor Brown over the top of each and every single lace. Once I had painted every single lace, I didn't even need to highlight any of them, because the details that I had added earlier to the outside main portion of the shoe, it will kind of stand out and distract you from looking looking at the laces. Also, I really don't care to add any more detail into the laces. For the little rope that's around her waist, this was quite easy really. I gave that a zenithal highlight when I painted them originally, and then I literally just slap a load of skeleton horde over the top. I do also spray over the bottom of that with the same skeleton horde just to make sure there is a gradient and help to make it look all smooth like airbrushing makes things look. I used brown to paint the little straps that those carabiners and things are attached to on her belt, and then I attached everything onto her belt using some super glue. I feel like this is the only option because they are very small keys and it would probably be impossible to do any kind of a magnet here. As for the pouch that is in the front, I used a dry brush to give it a bit of shadow and highlight definition, and then I just sprayed skeleton horde over the top, and this is the effect that you get from doing that. I also painted obviously the little button with a dark silver. Working on this little dinosaur, by the way, it was kind of difficult because I did not actually know how I was going to paint this color, so I started off putting Drakenhof Nightshade in the shadow. I then put a blue over the top of all of that because I felt like the Drakenhof Nightshade was not doing enough of a difference and I needed to make this thing blue. After I had made it blue, I then took Drakenhof Nightshade again and I used that to darken up the blues. This color specifically makes blues nice and dark like you can't imagine. Now, it would be a bit unfair of me to not actually let Frankie talk about the freaking dinosaurs, because this is the kind of thing that Frankie really loves, and I feel like you need to let Frankie explain to you the reason why we've been lied to when it comes to dinosaurs and what we know about them.
Jurassic Park franchise lied to you. This little guy is not a Velociraptor, he is a Deinonychus. Velociraptors were much smaller, much more agile, had very narrow skulls. The Deinonychus was a little bit taller, much bulkier, and had a much broader snout. Now, don't get me wrong, they're both apex predators for their size, but they also lived on entirely different sides of the planet. We had the Deinonychus living in Central America, and then we had the Velociraptor living in Asia around 75 million years ago, whilst the Deinonychus was around 100 to 125 million years ago. So they existed at entirely different times. And yes, all of that is just to say that we are painting a Deinonychus and not a Velociraptor.
Well, thanks for that, Frankie. That obviously means that the lady's name cannot no longer be the Raptor Ranger. She's gonna have to be the Deinonychus Ranger, which it just does not roll off the tongue as much. Anyway, I'm not going to worry about the names of absolute nerdism about dinosaurs, but I do like how they look, and this little guy is honestly one of the cutest little dinosaurs I have ever laid my eyes upon. After getting the skin tones to roughly where I was happy with them, I decided that I was going to take some of the Drakenhof Nightshade and paint that over some of the little bumps on his body. I also used that to really differentiate the line that goes through his mouth, and then I started working on his eyes, and on the insides of his eyes I wanted to paint a little bit of a pink over that little flap that's inside there before I then painted the whites. Now, I realized only after painting the whites of the eyes that I needed to actually put a little bit of a darker pink over that pink, and so I ended up putting this Magos purple. But annoyingly, this got onto the whites of the eyes and I could not be bothered to actually repaint the whites of the eyes again. So I just decided to move straight on to the next step, which was painting a yellow over the tops of those whites that I had put down. And once those parts of the eyes were done, it was time to move on to a thing that we argued about quite a bit in the studio. And this was the shape of the eyes themselves, the pupils, that is. And Frankie was not happy with the fact that I was giving him these slits because they do not have these, apparently. But according to me, this is literally just a cute lizard, and according to him, it has some frickin' Latin name that no one can pronounce, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you can paint your model how you want, and we both came to the conclusion that putting the slits in the eyes did make this guy look a little bit more aggressive than if he had have put the round ones. If I put round ones, he's cute enough as it is. He would have just looked like a cute little puppy dog, and I didn't really want that look for the model. So we decided that putting the slits was going to work out in the end. Frankie even had a fancy word for the shape of the frickin' pupils. I don't even know that word. I don't care, but I'm going to move on to something I do know, and that is skin tones. And for the skin tones, I painted Orcish dermis into the shadows of everything and came back over the top of that using that brown rose that I originally used to smooth things off just a little bit, because we do not want a solid Orcish dermis looking model. Now, this is slightly different to how I normally do skin skin tones, and I'm not so sure if I'm sold on this one, but I just stuck with it and I went through anyway because we needed to make sure that I'm trying things. I put a sunny skin tone over the top of everything else, and I can be honest, I think this needed to be thinner. The fact that it is so bright is probably the problem that I'm having with the skin tone, but I still pressed on and I used basic skin tone over the top of that, and at this point I decided to start thinning things down properly, which meant that it took even longer for this to cover over, and that started annoying me. So I ended up just moving on to adding a highlight, which is just adding a bit of white into that basic skin tone and spraying that into just very small specular areas of where the light would be hitting the most. I then take a little bit of yellow, probably about 4 or 5 drops, and a whole airbrush full of water, and spray that mostly into the shadows to tint the skin a little bit more yellow. I then spray a semi-gloss over the top from Kaleido, and I put that aside to dry while I work on some other parts of this model. The next things that I will be doing is painting the hair, and the hair is pretty straightforward. I'm going to paint over the top of it with this Blood Angels Red, because this color is one of those contrasts that, like I said, it just pulls and it does weird things, but it works in your favor for painting things like hair or anything really textured. And in this case with the hair, it meant that it pulled in all of the crevasses, making them a little bit darker than the raised portions of each hair. I can now take a little bit of an old wood color, which is a light brown tanny kind of color, and paint that over her jersey or her v-neck, whatever you call this thing that is covering her chest, because otherwise she would just be a cave lady, and it is not Cave Lady and the Raptor, it is the Raptor Ranger. So obviously the colors needed to match the whole Ranger vibes. She's obviously a safari lady of some kind. I took a little bit of skeleton horde and sprayed that into the shadows, and I realized really quickly that this was just not enough contrast for what I wanted. So I used a bit of Agrax Earthshade, and luckily I did use a skeleton horde, because that meant that there were 3 versions of colors on that t-shirt, making it a little bit more detail and look quite nice actually. I can now move on to painting her gloves, and I painted those really simply using Cygor Brown. But once I had painted the main color of the brown over the top, I came back using a red leather and I painted the little patches that are probably a strap that is strapping it together, and a patch that I don't know why there would be a patch on a glove, but there is a patch on this glove, and so I decided to paint it using that red leather. Doing this is really easy though. I'm just going to use the side of my brush, and I'm going to not actually go over the edges, because having a dark edge around that little red leather color is going to just make it stand out and look like it is framed nicely, and the separation is going to be good. I can use a light green to paint over her scarf, and I'm not actually sure if I have filmed any of what I did after that, but I basically just took a dark green and sprayed it over the bottom edges of that scarf in order to give it some depth. Now we're getting onto a place where I made a mistake, and I'm not sure why it was a mistake. And usually I would use Magos Purple to paint over the lips of models, and it would come out pretty much perfect. I would like the color that comes out. However, this color is no good, and we will see it in a bit when it dries. It's just not going to work for me, and we'll have to fix that later. But before we do that, and before I even realize that it's wrong, I'm going to start painting over the hands, and this is the other hand that is holding the gat. And that gat needs to be painted, obviously, with black, because this is the setup for later when I dry brush it. But once the gat is black, I can then paint the glove using the same Cygor Brown and the same procedures that I used on the other hand, which is literally paint the whole thing brown, and once it is sufficiently brown, I take red leather and very carefully paint over those patches that are on her arms, hands, I said hands. I can then take some dark silver, and I can use a dry brush and dry brush that over the gat. This is going to give a little bit of a metallic feel to the piece of material that we are painting. I glued that hand in because I feel like this can come apart as one, and it wouldn't be the end of the world, because this part of the model comes off by the arm anyway, and if it needed to travel, it would be able to come apart and travel easy enough. I'm going to take a bit of copper and paint that over the hair using a very dry brush in this instance, because this will grab the attention of your eyeballs by glistening just on the crisp edges of the hair. It was a little bit stark for me though, so I came back with some Caribou Crimson and sprayed that into the shadowed areas of the hair, covering up some of that copper but also giving it some depth. Now look at how terrible these lips are. I have absolutely no idea why they turned purple. She looks like like she has been defrosted, and the lips did never get defrosted. So I painted Orcish Dermis over the top of them, and this helped to give them a much pinker, softer effect. For her eyebrow caterpillars, I'm going to be using Cygor Brown and red leather mixed together, and I'm not going to film that perfectly because I feel like this would give away too many secrets. But really the truth is I just didn't keep it in frame and I'm an actual schmuck. For her cheeks, I gave her some blush using some fluorescent magenta. I sprayed this very carefully through my airbrush on a low pressure in order to not make a mess of things. I used Griff Charger Grey to give her some eyeshadow, which I think is the term for whatever it is that I painted there, and then I took some highlight skin and started painting the eyes. I realized very quickly that I had not painted the eyelashes yet, and so thus forth I went back and painted the eyelashes. Using black, I can carefully go around the outside of the eye and paint this eyelash section in. And the reason that I do this in this order is because if I make any mistakes with the black now, it's going to be a lot easier for me to cover up those mistakes using white when I come back in and paint this clearers of the eyes. If I try to do this later, I might make a mistake and it will be a lot harder to clean up if I went that way around. For the sclerers, I paint with a thin paint, probably 50-50, and I build this up as I go along, making it brighter in the center and a little bit darker on the edges. I'm now going to take some of this green color, which is one of the darker greens that I have, but it's not a very saturated green, to start painting the eyes. Of course, for green eyes, this is a cartoon character, a new school looking vibe, so I can go quite bright with the colors, but if you go too bright when it comes to green eyes, they might look like they are a little bit weird, and that's just a thing you don't want to do. So I'm going to try to stick with some mutual kind of greens and build them up as the details inside of the irises are necessarily needed to be done. I will put a black in the center of that as a dot, and that will obviously be the pupil, and then I can put a white specular highlight on each side of that. And obviously once that is fully dried, I will then put a gloss coat over the top. You must make sure it's dry. If it's not dry, you're going to have a sad time. I can now take this head of this model and put it on top of the body, thus calling this one done. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making this video, to be honest. I enjoyed making this model, and I quite like the process of working with other artists in order to create something unique and different. This is something that nobody has. I'll be honest, where have you seen this before? You might like it, you might not like it. Again, you know my feelings on your feelings. I don't really care if you don't like something, but if you do, well then of course the only place to get this is over in my Patreon. And not only would you get this, but if you did join at the Model Maestro tier, you will be getting behind the scenes pictures, you will get updates from Frankie sometimes, you also get palettes, which is the full color palette of every single paint that I used in the video, available for you to print out. In fact, you get that even at the lowest tier, but you also get early access to videos if I get them done on time, and a whole load of stuff. Not only that, but you will be supporting an artist and helping me keep the lights blinding my eyeballs. Of course, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who does support me over on Patreon, and of course everybody who watches the videos as well. Now leave a comment down below, share this video with your granny, and give me a like and perhaps subscribe. Of course, we are trying to get 1 million subscribers, so it'd be a good time for you to subscribe right now. And this is the part where I get to tell you, if you didn't like anything you saw in this video, I really don't care. And you can now kindly pause.